Awesome. So like Molly said, thank you for having me. My name is Ewurama. I am I guess, incoming second year PhD student in Northwestern Sociology Department. I'm also a Yale undergrad, class of 2017. I'm originally from Ghana. I grew up moving around and then came to the US for college. And so I'm really excited to be back at Yale to give this talk, but also to give it, I think, to a new audience related to like where I am now in my phase of my own work and career. And so I'm really excited for that. I'm also really excited that all these panelists are here, and I'm excited for when we get to that conversation and what, how they're going to be able to share their experiences with us as well as we move. So as Molly pointed out, today's conversation is called Navigating Race, Identity, and Difficult Conversations. And I think that the reason that we put this title is that we want to acknowledge several things. So that coming into a new space as international students, multiple identities are things that we're having to learn how to re-navigate in a new society and a new community. But also trying to account for the fact that in the United States, racial identity is a really central structuring concept here in the country, and is one that ultimately can guide and shape a lot of people's experiences while they are here. And so we wanted to both acknowledge the broadness of the experience that people will have, but also sort of center that complex and I think often challenging space for students of all ages. So why does this session exist? As I'm sure you can imagine and have seen on the news, right, there is been a global movement that has happened under a banner of Black Lives Matter, but I think represents a broader push, particularly amongst racialized populations, but especially Black people, to really speak up about the ways in which, the world oppresses, suppresses, and sort of excludes them from various both experience-based and systemic access. And so that has made race not just a central conversation, I think, in the United States, but globally in a way that is perhaps rare and newer for us than has been in the past. And so I think that one of the reasons that I find this session really important, as both someone who has experienced it and now sort of studies it, is the importance and value of recognizing that this discussion about race and identity isn't limited to the United States, but is in fact one that affects most parts of the world, but also that the way in which it manifests in the United States is unique and rare and perhaps new to many of us, and requires some space to really ground ourselves in certain kinds of knowledges that maybe we don't have to begin with. So there's a few things I like to do when I think about the value of this session. One is I like to think and really make clear that as much as I can sort of relate and empathize, I know the difficulties and challenges of really trying to remember, of entering into this space and not knowing what was going on. And so I found this quote in a journal article really important. It's funny when people speak of race. I don't know how you guys felt, but when I first came here, I knew nothing about race. I knew how to spell racism, but that's as far. I didn't even know what it really meant. I never looked it up in the dictionary. And so I think that one of what this quote really does is centers the fact that for some of us, this might be an entirely new discussion, not just, where we fit into the discourse, but what race even is and what it means to be of a race. And there are lots of reasons why that might be, but the reality is that we want to offer this session as a space to ground people in maybe some of the words, languages, and ideas that were new, that many of us experienced in our early days. And we don't, I think, by any means believe that we're going to be able to use that to sort of assuage or make easy the process in some dramatic sense, but we're hoping in some small way, we're giving people a little bit of a head start in that process, and hopefully sort of circumventing some of the challenges that people might experience in the early steps of sort of entering into this space and having to confront that conversation. I think the other thing is to name some of the ways international students typically navigate the challenges of race and race-based conversations and identity conversations writ large when they enter. So this is actually a study that was done with graduate students thinking about, well, how did they think about race upon sort of their arrival and in their experience? And I think the article points to three big things. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. One is that international students sometimes think that Americans make race a big issue, and so it doesn't have to be as serious as it is. Some people sort of present, well, I don't see color or race, and so this discourse isn't applicable to me. And in some cases, people might just feel like race as a concept doesn't matter to me. And I think what's important about these is I want to center empathy in that it is understandable that for some of us from the communities we come from, race isn't a big issue, right? Or that like we may have discourses that tell us that we don't see race or color. But I think that in the way that I've always thought about it, if when people come and visit my country, I would hope and like expect and believe that they would want to understand what it means to belong to my country, not just to breeze by. And so in the ways that ethnicity matters in my country, in the way that performing our cultural sort of heritage matters to my country, I think race is a really central part of a lot of people's experiences in this place. And so to say things like, I don't see race or color, is to erase a lot of people's existences and the experiences that they have had. And I often sort of draw the parallel to being in the United States. My international identity is very important to me because it's a lot of how I have come to understand where I belong. And so for someone to say to me, like, I don't acknowledge you as a foreigner, or I think that you must either act as American or like you don't belong, to me, that feels very similar to someone telling me they don't see race or color, which is that they're saying that they don't see who I am, and they don't see who I am based on the experiences that have shaped how I came to be the way that I am. And so I center this as a way of prefacing that you may be coming here with a lot of these feelings maybe, and they're in no way wrong or misguided. They're totally a reflection, I think, of where we all enter. But I also want to raise really early that how we communicate those feelings can be really important to how other people feel comfortable around us and experience us. And that's really important because as we build community, as you come into Yale and you experience the university, being able to see the people you are with and see their humanity and see their experiences is one important way in which we build community. And so if we can find ways, even if you don't know why race is important in the sense that it hasn't been for you in the past, finding ways to see how it might be relevant to other people's lives in the present, I think is always a really important and strong starting point for many people, international students entering into the community. The other thing I want to acknowledge, I think that perhaps is a little bit different for me between being an undergrad in the United States and being a graduate student, is that as an undergrad, I was mostly a student. And so a lot of my experiences had to do with like peer relationships and occasionally like things that happened in the classroom. But I think that as like professional students or graduate students or staff, we exist in a very different set of intersections of roles in the university, in that we are at the same time learners. We're here to learn and be students and learn from each other and learn from the classroom if we're in one, but also we're here to be teachers. And that means that we're also charged with the task of supporting students, and we're colleagues, right? Whether with each other or with faculty. And so I also think that one of the important things about this session and some of the terminology I'm offering is that I'm hoping that we can be aware of the fact that this will enter into multiple kinds of roles, in which at any point we'll have different kinds of power. You know, the ways in which we'll be able to exert power over our students is very different to how power will exist with our peers. And that has implications for the things that we say, right? Students will absorb what we say in a classroom. Students will be affected, and it will guide how they think about learning, not just what they learn. And so I also see the value of this session as being about offering grounding knowledge so that we're able to maneuver these multiple types of roles in the institution. And I'm hoping near the end that I'll be able to think a little bit about how some of the ways I've gone about navigating these difficult conversations manifests differently in these three roles as well. And so we'll get to that near the end. So what are we gonna do here? We're gonna briefly engage with some terms and concepts that I found to be challenging when I arrived as a student and sort of was thrown off by them. And then I'll spend a little bit of time at the end for takeaways that I found for how to maneuver some of these discussions, and then we'll move into the panel session. So I'm excited for you all to come on this little journey with us. Okay, so what is race? I always start this by prefacing that this is a word that most people cannot define, including the people who study it. And so the overwhelming feeling some people might get about like, well, I actually don't know what race I am, is one that's totally fair and understandable, I think, for everyone, even people who spent 20 years studying it as part of their career. I think what I want to point out is that there are sort of shared definitions that people are coming to about what race should be sort of considered as. And so you can see the definition here: physical differences that groups and cultures consider / make socially significant. And the reason I think that a lot of the definition has said physical differences is that we typically think of skin color. So that's, I think, the most central component of physical differences. But if you think, I think about how stereotypes manifest too in the world, we don't limit our understanding of racial identity to just skin color, right? So people feel like they can tell the race of a group based on nose size and all these other physical traits that, you know, we know like in and of themselves biologically are not significant in how they differ, but do become rendered socially significant when we are in a space with other people. And I think that we'll talk a little bit about like why that social significant term is important. But something I want to point out is that that's different from ethnicity, which for me was, I think, the most central part of my identity when I arrived as a student, which is the culture that people have based on our ancestry and our practices and our values and beliefs. And that was the identity that I really felt was centered as a person for me when I arrived. And so I had a hard time trying to sort of navigate, well, what does it mean that in some spaces, my culture is being sidetracked to focus on my physical appearance? And like, what does that mean for my identity? But I think that what's important to recognize as a result is that we end up with multi-layered relationships to race and ethnicity. There are two sort of concepts. I'm a sociologist. And so there are two concepts from sociology that I think are really valuable just in everyday life. The first is that race is ascribed. And this, I think, is often where the challenge begins, certainly was for me as an international student, that race is a category that can be involuntarily given to you, as opposed to something that you choose for yourself. And that's really important, not because people don't also choose to belong to a racial category, but that often the tension comes when it is ascribed to you and you do not necessarily feel that you belong to that racial category, right? But I think what's important to remember is that one may not necessarily feel like you belong to the ethnicity that is typically understood to have that racial category in the United States, and you could still belong to that racial status, right? And so that has implications because you're being ascribed that every time you enter into a new space. But where I think the discourse gets complicated is that race is not always a master status for everyone. And so when we talk about a master status, what we mean is like a topic or an identity marker you have that is considered your primary characteristic. And so coming into the United States, my nationality was definitely in my master status. I was an international student in a boarding school for a long time. And so for me, being not, in my case, when I was in school, British, was the primary identifying characteristic. And so to enter into a community and a social context where suddenly it wasn't my nationality that was my primary identifying characteristic, but my skin color, was a jarring experience. But it's important to understand too that like that's born out of a very long and very complex history in the United States of people being judged and categorized based on their skin colors as they enter into a space. And so though we may not always identify our race as a master status, it is still possible, right, that that might get ascribed to us in any space we enter. So I like to do this because I think that it's helpful for me to see examples of things. And so I offer an example of myself to think about sort of how I relate race and ethnicity and my nationality to one another. So I consider myself racially Black, which is, I think, based on, as you've seen for some of the definitions, the idea that in most spaces when I enter into them, I am ascribed to the racial category of Black based on my skin color. And obviously can't enter into a space and say I am other things because most people would be confused by that. But I also identify as being nationally Ghanaian. So I have a Ghanaian passport, that is my nationality in my country of origin. And then I consider myself ethnically Akan and Fanti, which is what my parents are. So within the context of Ghana, my parents are from two different ethnic groups. And so I consider myself ethnically part of those groups. But I also consider myself ethnically African. And this often is surprising to most people because it's not perhaps the most typical ethnic identity. But when I came to the United States, there are, to be honest, in my physical space, not enough Ghanaians for me to like entirely constantly invest in only my Ghanaian national identity. But I also was part of a really incredible African student group experience where I felt like I built a set of shared cultures with a group of students across the continent. And so it felt appropriate for my own identity to say that I was ethnically African, though like that refers to a very large context. It also refers to a very specific set of cultures that I built with a group of people that I recognize in other people who also come from the continent. So the purpose of that exercise is to sort of focus on four really major things. One is that all of this should show you race is socially constructed. And what we mean by that is that it is something that changes based on the context you are in, and so doesn't in and of itself exist, right? And that can often be difficult for people to wrap their heads around, because people are like, well, I have a skin color. But as I was reminding people earlier, your skin color is not the only basis for your race. And so we think of race as a much more complex set of features for any group. And so as a result, we must think of the category of whatever it means to be, say, in my case, Black, as derived from a set of social experiences and norms. Race is also something that is both ascribed and claimed, right? And this is an important tension for everyone, I think, not just international students, but also many of the peers I met in the United States, which is that race is both something that is given to you and it is something that you claim. And so I feel certainly personally that when I arrived in the US, it was something that was ascribed to me. And then over the course of being here, I found ways to claim that process and space of being Black and redefined it based on my own experience. The important thing is that it is also socially real. And so often when people hear socially constructed, they assume that that must mean it's not real. And that's not in fact the case, right? Race is defining people's experiences. It is shaping how people respond to you. It is in this country shaping the active access to resources people have. And so we must always try to exist in a space where we are aware of how we are all opting into our own choices of identity, and aware that because of its ascribed nature, sometimes people are gaining benefits and challenges because it is being used as a basis for how we structure society. And this last one, I think, is something I have come to learn over time, which is that race is also globally relevant. So I think when I arrived in the US, I was convinced race was an American thing. And one of the things I've come to learn is that most populations in the world are either racialized or racialize others. And so I've had to really think through for myself, and this is something that I think I encourage others to do as they move through their time here, is to think about the ways in which, though race as the specific category may not be the one that exists in your country necessarily, how is race identity similar to class in your country? How is it similar to gender in your country? But also taking race as a category and thinking, well, what races do we have in my country? Is it possible that we have those kinds of categories and I just didn't know before? I think that this is a space where understanding that race is more than just an American concept, but really a global concept, really allows us to understand that we are not exempt from the ways in which we've come to understand different racial groups, even prior to entering into the United States. So with that, I want to move into some terms you might encounter in general conversation. And it was really important to me not just to focus on the sort of high level, like what is race and what is ethnicity and what does it mean to identify with those, but also that there are terms that sort of appeared when I was a student and I was like, do I fit into this group? Like, how do I maneuver this term? So the first one for me is people of color. And I think is the one that I remember being most jarring for all international students, because what it means to be of color is not something that feels obvious to some people. The general understanding is that it's an umbrella term in this country for all people who are not white. Now, what that means is that in reality, there are people who might present as white who might also still identify as people of color, right? And so that's really important too, is that the tension between a culture and one's position in the society and what you present as physically as a racial category. I think what's important to recognize is that people of color as a term, different people who belong to that group have different relationships to that term. So I've come to embrace that term, I think, for myself, in that it gives me a category to mobilize with other people who perhaps are having similar experiences to me. But I also have friends who I think really don't like that term because they feel like it lumps a large group of people together and really doesn't tell you very much about who they are and how their experiences are differentiated. But I think what's worthwhile, regardless of where you end up on feeling about that term, is that it is a term that is used, and we must be careful about how we choose to use it in other spaces, right? Because if we are callous in applying it to people who perhaps don't identify as people of color, or if we're using it as a way of forcing someone into a category, then we're actively trying to force an identity onto a person that isn't true for them. And the flip side is some people might find themselves being called people of color and not feeling like that was a category that they belonged to before. And so really trying to be conscious of, if you have that feeling, well, what is your resistance to being considered a person of color? And trying to really think through like, well, what does that mean about your relationship to other people in that category? But also, why are you not okay with that term? And learning and figuring out how to articulate that is a unique process for everyone, but I think one that I encourage everyone to do, because everyone's relationship to this term will ultimately be very distinct and different. The next is privilege. So the general definition is the benefit or advantage granted to individuals or communities by structures and institutions. And I think that often when people hear privilege, they feel very personally attacked. And people are like, well, I've had really challenging experiences, so what do you mean by I have privilege? You don't know my life. And that's absolutely true. People do not necessarily know your life. But I think that what's important about the definition is that it's social structures and institutions. And so this is where, right, the ascribed status we keep talking about comes back in, which is that if some people are ascribing an identity that you don't belong to, that also means that you might gain some benefits that you didn't expect to gain, or you might not even see that you gain. So I think that the most sort of common use of this term for many people is white privilege. But I'm someone who is very open about talking about the fact that I think we as a society need to acknowledge that privilege exists in very complex intersectional ways. I was very blessed to be able to afford, and my parents were able to afford to send me to really like amazing schools. I have a great deal of class privilege when I enter into a space as a result of that process. And what that means is that when I come into certain spaces, I am aware that I am ascribed some advantages because people assume certain things about me on the basis of that. They assume that I am hopefully competent. I hopefully think that they assume that, you know, I'm capable of taking on certain kinds of tasks. And that has implications, right? Because if we're giving extra kinds of benefits to people, even in assuming the absolute best of them, that has implications for questions like, well, who isn't being granted those benefits and advantages? And what does that mean for the sort of broader society? And honestly, for the broader set of people that we belong to community with, if some of us are being given privileges and others are not. And the reason I center privileges as a term is that what that means is that for some people entering into Yale for the first time, you might find yourself being told you're being given privileges that you don't necessarily recognize. And recognizing that the person isn't telling you you have not ever had a difficult experience, or even that in this moment life is not difficult, but rather that there are access to certain structural advantages that regardless of what choices you make or the other person made, one of you could get access to and the other one might not, right? And so people are really trying to highlight with privilege an inequality and unfairness that is in a system rather than within individuals. And so I always try to encourage people, when you hear that term, the term isn't being applied to necessarily just your individualized set of experiences, but where you exist within the structure you share with somebody else. And so it is really a relational term, not just an individualist term. And I always encourage people to engage with it as such. Microaggressions. So I think many people by this point have sort of engaged with this term, but it's generally the notion of a subconscious or well-meaning action or remark that ends up creating that sort of reflects unconscious bias and may end up hurting the person on the receiving end. So I always like to show examples because I think microaggressions, the thing about them that is most difficult is because they are often reflections of unconscious bias. We're not often aware that they're hurting people. And so this was a student photo campaign in which the students were sort of like articulating some of the microaggressions that they've experienced from their peers. And so you can see, you know, on the left, Courtney was told, "I never see you as a Black girl." Another student said, "So what do you guys speak in Japan? Asian? No, where are you really from?" And all of these concepts, you know, maybe coming from a genuine place on the part of the questioner, right? But if we take a second to think about, as we talked about earlier, saying to Courtney, you don't see her as a Black girl, has implications for erasing perhaps some central part of her experience and how she's existed, right? And I think that for many international students, one of the things that's important to recognize is that microaggressions can also happen to us. And I think that the example in the middle was really important for me to show. This question of, well, what do you speak in Japan, Asian? I have a hard time even trying to articulate like the ways in which I don't understand this phrase, but recognizing, right, that like, that shows not just an unawareness of a person's life, which we can all be ignorant about lots of things. There's too much in the world to know everything. But what is presented here was not a willingness to learn on the part of the questioner, but a decision made for the person they were asking. Like they just made the assumption. They could have asked, what do you speak in Japan? And the question could have ended there if that was an answer they did not know, right? But by ascribing a concept like Asian, they were suggesting that they sort of lump Japan into some larger category of people. And anyone who's engaged with the Asian continent can tell you there are very different cultures even within neighboring countries, right? And so to ascribe it in this way is to erase that complexity that someone is coming from. And this question of no, where are you really from, I think is always difficult for people in the beginning. But if you ask someone a question and they tell you where they're from, as we've been talking about, part of our role as peers and colleagues and teachers is to acknowledge a person's choice of identification. But if you ask a question, no, where are you really from, you're suggesting you think the answer the person chose for themselves is actively wrong. And so there is an answer that is more right that you believe on your part you're looking for. And that creates an environment in which we aren't being welcoming of each other. We're not opening our arms and being aware of the ways in which a person's choice of identity is born out of a very long and very complicated process of engagement for themselves that we can't always see. And then the last thing is racism. That was an accident. And so as you can see, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on racism, though one could give a whole lecture on it, perhaps a class. But the one thing that I want to point out is that when we talk about racism, racism isn't one thing. So I think people hear the term and they imagine one, and I often tell people it's that second layer, it's interpersonal, right? The idea that I say mean things to another person based on stereotypes about their skin color. And that's often the narrow definition people have. But I think that the important thing to recognize is actually racism is very complicated and very diverse, right? There is internalized racism where we're thinking about the ways in which you have negative views about your own racial group and ascribe those views in how you practice your engagement with them or how you describe that group to others. There is institutional and systemic racism. And I think what you're seeing in the world today is we're really moving away from interpersonal to the institutional and systemic. The idea that racism isn't just something we do to one person does to another, but that systems can be racist, right? And I think that the example that's been raised in this country and several others is the policing system, where certain groups of people are disproportionately affected by the process related to other groups. And I think that the reason this is important to point out is what that means is this is really connected to the privilege question. What that means is that even if one is not interpersonally racist, one might be benefiting from institutional racism, right? And systemic racism. And that means that, as we talked about, there are inequalities between the experience you are walking into and other people are walking into. And I always try to tell people this, I came into college with 150 other international students. And I can tell you that based on the fact that some of us, we were of different races, we had very different experiences. And that had to do with the fact that the institution and the system read us differently and then afforded us different privileges and advantages or disadvantages in various ways and cases. And I don't want to delve into all the specifics, but I want to bring that up to point to people that even in your own community of international students you might build while you are here, that you will find that those systemic and institutional racist structures will reshape how some of you experience the process over others. And if we're here to build a community with one another, it's important for us to acknowledge that that means that some people are in fact entering into difficult spaces and others might not be. And what does that mean for us to come as a community together, acknowledge the personal challenges we have, the challenges we share, and the ones that are different from one another, and be able to advocate for each other on all of those questions and ideas, right? So we've done all this, there's all these words, there's all these concepts, and I know that for many people, what this might feel like is oh, so does this mean that everyone's constantly going to call me a race I don't feel, or am I constantly going to feel attacked? And that's not at all the case, right? But I think what we're trying to do here is to point out that over the course of your time at Yale, you will enter into difficult conversations about these topics. You might have some of these things happen to you that you didn't expect. And so I want to really spend the last few minutes thinking about, well, how can we navigate these conversations? What are some ways that can help us develop? And as we move into the panel, you'll get to see sort of other people's perspectives and ways they've maneuvered this. But I just wanted to give sort of three things that I've come to learn since I came here. The first is to listen. And it sounds very easy. I was convinced if there's anything I'm good at, it's listening, although people who know me now know that I talk better than I listen. And I'm absolutely a believer in that most of us are really bad listeners. Because listening isn't hearing the words someone is saying. Listening is hearing what someone is trying to tell you from their mind, from their heart, whatever is being said. And so it's not just looking at the words that are being uttered, but also the intentions behind them, the emotions people are trying to convey with the words, and recognizing that the reason it is important to listen is because we're not always good with words, ironically. And so how do we as a group and community try to hear both what is said and what is unsaid? And what's important about that is I think that over time you will find that that's how people see things they didn't see before, right? Ways in which certain phrases we use, like "I don't see color," actually are very hurtful to people if you listened. But because many of us are only focusing on hearing the words that are coming and not listening to them, we're not engaging with their meaning. And so I found that in the early conversations, I really needed to listen to what people were feeling, what people were saying, what people were frustrated about. And the reason it was also important was because I needed people to listen to me. I needed people to listen to why it was that I didn't understand what was happening around me. I needed people to listen to the fact that I needed help in understanding and learning things about this conversation that I didn't have before. And so I encourage people not just to listen in your personal life, but make an effort, go to talks. You know, the university, despite being online, is going to, I imagine and believe, put in a lot of effort into having sessions and spaces where people can engage with questions. And so pushing people to really listen first is really important to me. The second is be free with apologies. This one is also one I think people think they do, but they often don't, which is being willing to say I was wrong. Not just, I guess you win, or, well, let's just agree to disagree. That's not apologizing. That's trying to end a discussion. But I mean, like, being willing to say, I'm sorry, I didn't know, I was wrong, acknowledging when we have made mistakes, because that's how we grow. If we're incapable of doing that, then we're not learning from each other. We're just like having momentary experiences and then forgetting them. And I'm someone who, you know, I don't know that pride is the appropriate term, but I, you know, don't think I'm wrong often. And so had to really learn, like, what does it mean to have to learn to apologize? And like to do it in a way that means something to the person that's listening to me, because the apology is ultimately for them. And if the apology they're being given is, I think you were upset and so I'm sorry, well, then that's about me. That's not about how they feel. That's about me trying to assuage my own guilt that they feel bad. What they needed to hear was, I'm sorry I hurt you. I'm sorry I couldn't understand, or I'm sorry I can't understand. I do this often and she enjoys it. My best friend is an African-American, and we had to go through the really difficult process of learning, like, actually, I don't understand what you're talking about. I like cannot wrap my head around it. And I'm sorry that my inability to do that feels like it is distance. And we found over time that the longer we were able to apologize to each other, the less we needed to, because the more we were able to see that at the heart of the conversation, we cared. And we were trying really hard to see each other always. And then the last thing is lead with empathy. And this is one that I think the world as a whole really needs in this moment. But I want to like center it in this conversation and say that we will encounter situations where we say things we didn't know would have the effect they had. We would say things we didn't mean, but also others would say things that they didn't mean or understand. And leading with empathy does not mean letting things go, by no means. I'm a big believer in telling people when they have overstepped a line or when something they've done hurts me. But when I say lead with empathy, I mean see that action, acknowledge how you feel, and try to put yourself in the shoes of where that person came from. And the reason that I encourage people to do that is not because you are going to sort of forgive without discussion, but because it allows the discussion to be fruitful. If you can't see how someone arrived at the feeling that they had, then it is very difficult to move forward in a conversation where you learn from one another. And so I've had to go through this process of really having to think, okay, well, people have said things to me that are really hurtful, but why would a person do that? What might have happened in their lives, or what might they not have experienced that might lead to that? So I vividly remember this. my second week of freshman year, I was sitting with a peer who was a German student, and we were on a bench, and a student walks up to us who was his friend. And she says, we introduce ourselves, and my friend is like, oh, she's also an international student. So she asked me, where are you from? I said, oh, I'm from Ghana. And then her question was, well, why do you speak such great English? And I was a little bit confused by this concept. And then she was like, well, I just thought you all spoke French down there. And I remember being furious. I was like, what does that even mean? French down there? I don't know where to start. And I had to stop and think to myself, what opportunity would this person have had to ever hear about Ghana? Like, in what time would that have happened, right? And I have since gotten an education degree, so I know not many opportunities to learn about Ghana, but I didn't know that at the time. But I had to take the step back and think to myself, I'm angry. I absolutely have a right to be angry. And why would she not have that answer? Why would that answer be the way she framed it? And I remember at the time sort of sitting with my friend and having to talk through, like, what would I have said differently? And I think now, something that I've reflected on is, had that situation happened now, I would have said, so we speak English because Ghana is an English-speaking country. And like, that was a statement that I felt hurt by, but I'm not sure that you've ever heard of Ghana. So do you have questions specifically about that? Now, it's important to understand that, like, how I show my empathy is a choice that I make. So you're, over the course of your time here, going to meet people who maybe don't want to show empathy in the way that you expected. And that's okay, right? And that can be difficult, in that maybe you were hoping someone might be there and sit with you, or like explain to you something they don't understand. And some people don't want to do that. And we have to understand that that's because for some people, they've been doing that their whole lives, and they're trying to make space to not have to do that. And some people are totally willing to share in the way that we expect or want. And the important thing as we lead with empathy is being able to see why someone might want that space, why someone might not want to have that conversation with you, and also why someone would want to have that conversation. These are not like the be all end all of surviving difficult conversations by any means, but I hope always that when I apply them in my life, and I try and fail often, but every time I try and try again, I find I get a little bit better at hearing people, and I also get a little bit better at hopefully contributing, to the conversation that is happening around me from my own experience, while taking into account others. So with that, I'm going to end bang on time, which is rare for me. And I want us to move into the panel. So let's stop share so we can see as many faces as possible. Wonderful. As Molly said, please feel free to put the questions in the chat. We'll definitely start off, I think, with some of the sort of questions that we had prepped, just so the panel can sort of give people their own thoughts. Would the panel like to start by just briefly introducing yourselves so that people have a sense of who you are? Who wants to start? Gerardo, I see you off mute, so I'm going to pick on you.
Oh, okay. I am Gerardo. I am from Mexico City, and I am a second-year master's student of African Studies.
Who would like to go? Okay, Jeamme.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jeamme. I'm a second-year master's student at the School of the Environment, and I'm originally from Penang in Malaysia.
Everyone, I'm Sam. I'm a senior in Yale College, so coming at this from a slightly different perspective, and I'm studying social psychology and global health. I'm from Zimbabwe.
So thank you all for joining us. I'm really excited that we're going to get to do this. And I wanted to jump right in, and I sort of wanted us all to start at the beginning. I think it's important to sort of try to remember and put ourselves in like our own experiences when we first arrived. And so when you sort of got to the US for the first time, how did you find yourself being perceived differently? Was there like new ways people were identifying you that you were sort of surprised to have happened to you, or you expected? And anyone can jump in and give their thoughts on that.
Sam, you want to go ahead? I'll
Sure.
go after you.
I was like,
Yeah, we all kind of unmuted.
do it.
It was very exciting. So I think whenever I start a question like this, this question of what it is to engage with race coming to the US, I am very obviously a white boy from Zimbabwe. And so race has always been a very central part in what my life has been. I've always been kind of the minority, but a minority existing as a privileged one. in a certain context. And I think when I first came to the US, one of the strangest processes was suddenly being not only a privileged minority, but now a privileged majority, and what that difference becomes, and how, in many ways, the privilege that comes with now the additional element of being a majority is that you can exist in spaces where you can hide from that privilege. You can be treated in a way that the race can almost be backgrounded. And one of my very good friends in first year from Kenya said this to me, and it's something that I've held as I've moved through my kind of 4 years in the US, is I'm often given positions of influence because I am exotic but safe. And so what does that mean as existing as a racial entity where I am exotic because I'm from Zimbabwe and so can speak to these things, like existing on this panel of equity and inclusion and what that means, but I'm safe because I'm not a threat, you know? There are people who are white who can come to me and say things and think that it's okay to say it to me because I'm white. I'm a safe space where they can kind of tell me what they really think. And so in this discussion that Ewurama presented about what it is to have this ascribed racial identity, this kind of whiteness and unity of that privilege was very much ascribed to me in a way that is something that I continually am wrestling with, and how I navigate that in the US, which feels deeply different to what it has been back home.
Yeah, I think for me it was I am, you know, ethnically Chinese, and in terms of like and Hakka and all these different things, but in Malaysia that I knew that was the case, right? That Malaysia is a very racialized country as well. But coming here, what changed was then I knew I was Chinese. I knew I was a very specific kind of Chinese, and I was Malaysian, and that meant other kinds of cultural traditions and food and beliefs. But then coming here, I realized I was then lumped together with all other Chinese Americans and Chinese students. And so people would be very confused when they'd be like, oh, you're not from China. I was like, no, I'm not. Like, my family hasn't been from there for like generations. And it was always a very complicated conversation to have with people when they'd be like, oh, you don't eat these things, or you don't speak the language the same way, or oh, you speak this other language, but but you look Chinese. And then I have to explain to them, like, it was really very funny in undergrad. I always felt like I had to explain to people the idea of immigration, that immigration existed as a concept, and it was like impossible for some people to understand that. So I think that being ascribed that particular category was very challenging to me, because it came with so many assumptions. And sometimes you don't have the space to have these conversations with people. You can't sit down and say, well, let me talk to you about like how my family and how Malaysia is different from China. It's in Asia, about all of these different things. And sometimes I just learned to like walk away from some of these conversations. But I think that was the main one that I felt when I was here for undergrad.
I think for me, it began even before I came to the United States, when I had to file an application and for the university and apply for a visa, where they ask you, identify yourself, like, what race are you? And then I'm from Mexico, but Hispanic as a race for me was profoundly troubling. And it's not as if I'm ignorant of that Hispanic Latino is considered a race in the United States, and it has very particular characteristics. But now I had to identify as this race that I don't feel like in order to even apply to come here. Because the racial categories that exist within my society are not the same ones that exist in the United States. So I would identify myself as a mestizo, like a mixed race person, like mixture between Native American and Spaniard and whatever. So coming here and being adscribed a race that I consider to be a culture is very difficult. It doesn't mean that I don't understand how that came to be in the United States and how that shapes social relations here. But it still feels very uneasy. And also like having this particular identity that I don't fully identify with complicates things because not everyone sees me as Hispanic. In certain contexts, I'm seen as white, which I also find problematic. In other contexts, I'm seen as a person of color. And what does that mean? The first time I heard that, I was like, am I? Like, what am I? I didn't have like resistance to be identified like that, but I wanted to know if it was a proper space for me to be in, like to find which spaces you're allowed to be and how you can engage with different people and being respectful is not always straightforward. So I think that was my first experience here.
Yeah, I appreciate you all sharing that. And it made me think about like, I think something that came up for me listening to all of you is this question of like, whatever position people found themselves in or whatever that first instance of experience, there was unease for everyone. And I'm curious about how you sort of maneuvered that unease. Like what choices did you make? Were there spaces that you went to? Like what things are you using to help you move through that unease? And if you're still feeling that, and I think that I heard in Gerardo's answer, the notion that that unease doesn't necessarily go away over time, and I resonate with that. How are you managing that unease? Like, what does that look like for you?
Does anyone want
Gerardo,
to go, or can I?
Yeah, jump in. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I feel that listening, as you said, is very important, but also recognizing that a lot of people are willing to hear you out. Like it goes both ways. So I try to understand how people see me. And I found that a lot of people are willing to hear my unease. Like, yeah, I understand why here I am perceived in this particular way. This is why I come from a place where race exists, but it's not the one of the main facts of life. I identify myself racially in this way. This is not entirely compatible of the things that Americans place on top of me, but so when you're able to explain to people how you feel, and they listen to you, I feel that helps, because it's a two-way street in which you have to understand that you're in a different context and respect that and live through that. But it's also nice to hear that people are willing to pay attention to what you have to say about yourself.
I think for me, a lot trying to navigate that unease came with like really questioning why that was the case. Like, why did I feel uncomfortable? To some extent, it's feeling, that a part of my identity was erased, as you were mentioning in your remarks earlier. But I think it also then made me, I spent a lot of time during, in college and slightly after, sort of questioning like what it meant to identify as ethnically Chinese, both in my own life back home, and now here in the United States. And so I think that prompted a lot of that sort of reflection, and a reckoning with like in terms of like my family history, but also then the history of Chinese Americans in the United States, but also like much more recently, like navigating being Chinese when China is considered a superpower, right? Considered to be ethnically Chinese and seen this way, and everyone sees me and they're like, oh, this person is Chinese, and what that means in the context of the currents of global structures of power. And I think I would say that's kind of been what I've really struggled with or sort of worked on the last couple of years. And I just want to echo the comments before, where some of it was just having conversations with people. For people who would listen, just talking to them, being like, well, this is not, I don't speak the language in this way, or just kind of explaining to them that Malaysia or Indonesia or Singapore, you know, we are considered maritime Southeast Asian countries with fairly shared histories. We may relate to race in a different way, and this is how our cultures and ethnic identities have intersected and changed the way that we identify with being a certain race or ethnicity.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with so much of what was just said, and the one piece I would like to add on top of it, which is something I think Ewurama brought up in her presentation, is as we talk about listening, also what it means to listen internally, and this idea of discomfort. And I think discomfort is a very powerful and a very volatile emotional response, that if you're in a situation that you are uncomfortable, if you are not aware of where that discomfort is stemming from, you can be very reactive, you can be defensive. It's a time to put up your guards, and you create stereotypes, and you try and justify self-identities that, oh, I am ascribed this way, how dare they, therefore I must exist in a certain way. When instead, if you take that, you know, that moment of pause, and, you know, there's been a lot that's been written about the power of a moment of pause, to then say, okay, I have this unbelievable discomfort or unease. What is that as a teaching experience for myself? Why am I feeling uncomfortable? Am I uncomfortable because someone has said something to me that is offensive? Am I uncomfortable because there's an insecurity here that I want to present myself in a certain way, even though I'm not that way? And where is that discomfort coming from? And I think when you enter a new space, in this case, the US, that has this entirely different set of norms, there's inevitably in those growing pains a vast amount of discomfort that comes up. And I think one of the most important things for me was really just trying to embrace it whenever it came and not run from it. So it's not that discomfort comes, oh shit, what's happening? It's discomfort comes, great, what, why? So trusting the body in that sense.
Yeah, that's, Sam and I spent a lot of time talking about this, that something that I believe too is I think that discomfort is the first step in learning. And if you're not uncomfortable, then it's very difficult to learn. You're often then being told something you already know. And if you don't feel that, then you should be asking yourself, like, what am I missing and what am I not? What am I not pushing myself for? I'm aware that I don't want us to end too late, so I want to open it up before I ask my last question. Does anyone have a question? We're a small enough group that I'm happy for someone to unmute themselves. Just use the raise hand function and we can do that. Does anybody have a question that they want to pose to the panel before we close out? Anything at all? Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I don't know where the raise hand function is on this.
I saw you raise your hand physically, so that counted.
I figured there was a small enough group I could just do that. So something that you talked about, the term person of color, is something I've always struggled with. You never know what the right term to use is. I personally turn to say person of color, not necessarily to define a difference between white and non-white, but I don't want to categorize somebody in a certain way that's not correct. And I was wondering what the thought is on that, because, like, as you said, I don't want to say something like, I don't want to, ignore differences, because I think differences are great, but I also don't want to assume in a category. And so I wanted to know what the thoughts are on that, like, because, I don't want to say person of color to offend and offend somebody, but I also don't want to, assume that they're a certain race or anything like that, or a certain category without,
Yeah, I hear that. How does anyone on the panel have any thoughts for Jesse's answer? This question of, like, how do you decide what words to ascribe, particularly around people of color, if you don't want to assume a racial group that a person belongs to, or even necessarily that they only belong to one?
I think that's an interesting question because as you described before, like international students may not I always have heard this word before, and then when confronted by it, they're like, what are you talking about? Like, so I think it's like, I know for me personally, I like completely understand that impetus, and I welcome it just because it gives the other person like the agency to self-identify, which I think is what meant, that's the intention, right? You want someone to self-identify. But I do think that often international students would probably struggle with just the very word itself and the concept, and just because they'd be like, what are you talking about? I am clearly this. Like, you know, someone would say, if someone said to me, when I was younger, it'd be like, you're a person of color, I'd be like, I don't know what you're talking about. But then they may also be like, well, I don't want to say you're like Chinese American or anything, because I would be like, oh, I'm not. Yeah, so I understand the impetus. I do think that it does, I guess, to complicate it, it's just that most international students likely would not have heard of it, especially if they just got here, or yeah.
Sam or Gerardo? Yeah, Gerardo.
Well, I think there are advantages in ambiguity and in terms that encompass a lot of things. But for instance, the first time that I encountered this word, I was baffled by the specific meaning. For instance, there was, to give a very stupid example, there was, I think the first month I was here, a lunch for people of color, free lunch. And as a graduate student from the third world, free lunch sounds very appealing. But I thought, okay. And I got an invitation in the email. So Yale considers perhaps I'm a person of color. I could be one, but what if I'm not? Like, what if I show up here and people look at me, say, oh, why are you here if you're not a person of color? And there's not someone you can actually ask and say, excuse me, sir, madam, am I a person of color? Could you please tell me? So eventually you can get the gist, but there's also like pitfalls in ambiguity and in all these encompassing terms, especially if you're not familiar with the context.
Okay, I don't know if Sam's gonna say anything. My one add-on is I'm in a different situation, I think, in the way that Jeamme and Gerardo are describing, and that my racial category for most people is relatively unchanging. And I often make the joke that every once in a while I just want to walk into a space and tell people like, no, I'm white. What do you mean? Just like for my own like sense of like trying to understand like how will a person respond to that. I have found watching my friends and for myself that I am really open, and I think this takes a lot of work, and it took me probably 5 out of the 6 years I've been here to learn to be okay just asking. And so like I found ways, and I know that we have staff here. This is something that has come up. I've just started TAing a section. I'm trying to implement into my teaching practice spaces where we just tell each other those things. Like in the same way we're using pronouns, like figuring out like how do we as people just implement into our systems and structures of space creation, getting people to identify themselves. Like you're just as, if we're willing to recognize that the social nature of gender means not everyone uses the same pronouns, then we should be able to recognize that not everyone racially identifies the same way. And like, why are we so afraid of allowing people to say their racial identity the same way we have people say their gender identity? And so I'm wrestling with like how to do that in a way that like doesn't jar everyone out of their seat, because I think that for many people, like that will be an entirely new experience. But I'm really thinking about like ways to make that a central part of my practice, whether that's like creating like 4 corner activities where people can at least talk about how they are or are not racialized, or like in the context of the introduction, pushing people to like tell me how they racialize themselves. Because to me, it's no different than wanting to get your name pronunciation right, wanting to call you by the gender identity you have. I want to be able to refer to you by the terms that you want to be referred to, not the ones that I've ascribed to you. And if I'm not willing to ask, then there's no way to get there. And so it's always complicated because not everyone wants to respond that way. And I'm someone who like would find that question strange because my assumption would be like, but like, look at me. Is that, you know what I mean? But like, I would rather I was asked and reiterated what I thought was obvious than not. And I absolutely agree with your comment in the chat. Like there are some people who might not take that well. And I think that has to do with like how taboo that conversation is. But and maybe this is also like part of why like my like love for higher ed administration is like, we have the ability to preface well if we choose to. And so like, what does it mean to preface like why we're making that choice to our students? Like I had my TA section yesterday and I was like, I'm gonna ask lots of questions about like, do you want the chat off? Do you want the chat on? And you're all gonna think I'm strange, but I'm doing that for a reason. I want you to feel like you're participating in creating this space. And I think that as Gerardo pointed out, like people actually are more willing to hear. It's just that like, if it comes at them without like preface or understanding, then their interpretation can run wild. But if we're doing the work of like, here's why I'm asking this question, then we can. Does that work? Did I see a hand somewhere? I wasn't sure if I saw it. Oh, yeah.
I had one, but I'm not sure how much time we have left.
Jeamme, do you need to run? Okay.
I have to run, but you guys should continue.
Okay, well, do you want to say
just have to.
And then we might do a few more questions before you
Sorry.
head out. Do you want to say anything before you?
Just thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and thank you to ISS for organizing this. This is pretty amazing. So hopefully see you guys around. Bye.
Bye. Yeah, Jenny, I think we might take one or two more and then run off.
Thank you. This is amazing. Thank you so much for everyone who's participated and is sharing your knowledge and experience. I really appreciate it. I'm just curious. So thank you for how you each shared kind of moments of dis-ease and unease. I'm curious if there might be a moment you're willing to share once you were in the US where you felt like, okay, now this is actually a moment where I feel at ease, and what kind of facilitated that. I am a chaplain, and so just thinking about maybe it's just time or finding your people, but what was a moment where it's like, okay, this isn't home, but I'm feeling more known and at ease?
Sam, Gerardo?
You haven't had that yet. That's also okay.
I have to think a second, but do either of you have a thought yet? I'll go. It's a challenging question. One, because I'm someone who has learned, I built my like relationship to developing my identities on being uncomfortable anyway. And so I'm rarely at ease generally. Like, and that's like, I mean, I like people that know me know this, like I watch a lot of television and like, I'm rarely at ease even watching television because I'm sitting there being like, well, that stereotype choice was specific, but I guess that's what you went with. I will say that I can redefine at ease for me as like when I felt like I was in a space where I trusted the people. And I think that there were like it actually has to do with my two closest friends. One is Sam, and then the other one is my best friend, Ashley, which is that like, I knew that I could trust those people around the conversations I have about race when they were willing to go toe to toe with me without disrespecting me. And so I think that that's very different for different people. But for me, like, I need to feel like my friends are willing to like have a hard conversation. And then we're willing to be like, we're having this hard conversation because we're trying to grow. So like I'll talk about Rhodes. We like hang out a lot. And one of the challenging things was he came one day and he was like, I want to apply for this thing. How do you think it will look? And I had like a really hard time. He knows this. Like I had a really hard time because I know him so well. And so like how his racialization is experienced really frustrates me because I'm like, yes, but he's like, I always want to be like, but he's not like other white people that people want to racialize him as. But I also understand why it's important that the system is the way that it is and we both exist in it. And so we had like, I remember that day being like one of the few times that I felt like we had fought about anything where I was like frustrated, right? He's nodding because he knows that that's also true. But it was also one of the few times where I was like, if I don't have someone who's willing to do this with me, then we haven't built the trust that I think is important and necessary. And so over time, I've come to believe that like trust is important. I'm still in the growing process around like how to allow for different kinds of trust, because I've realized that like that's a very, like the kind that I'm describing with Sam or the kind with my best friend where like we were notorious for sitting in like our like cafe in ed school and then like sitting there for an hour, like yelling at each other about like why our definitions of Blackness are unfair to the other one. And like, that's not everyone's style of contestation. And so how do I allow myself to define other versions of trust to incorporate more people? But I absolutely think that regardless of where you stand, I don't know how you do this work or engage in this conversation if you aren't willing to trust others and like show people that you can be trusted. And I think that that's often what breaks most people's hearts, and certainly mine, is when like a person I trust like breaks that trust by doing something that is like actively shocking, like saying things that I thought by now they would have seen hurts me, or like saying those things and then not acknowledging how those might hurt me in that moment. Like those are things that hurt. That for me was important. And I had to learn that too in the reverse. Like when I came to the university, I like really had never met a person who identified as queer before. Like everyone that surrounded me was straight. And so I was going through a process around like gender and sexuality that people I knew were going through with race, which was like, well, what do I do? Like, I don't know. And like one of my closest friends was gay, and we had to have a hard conversation where he was like, sometimes you say things and I look at you like you're crazy. And I was like, thank you for telling me that. And that was like a slow process where I had to trust that he was going to tell me when I had made a mistake and trust that he meant it well. And so I'm someone who wants to believe in figuring out ways to build trust with people, because once you have that as a foundation, I think many of the harder challenges and conversations can still be had respectfully. Sam, Gerardo, thoughts? Yes.
I would I think I'm listening to your question, Jenny, and I think there's two very different contexts in which that question manifests. One is, how do you create these conversations of ease over months and years, and kind of this deep investment to create that level of trust and intimacy and honesty. And then the second part of that question is, how in a conversation with someone, you know, sitting down with them, how do you create a sense of ease? And have there been moments, and this is how I was trying to think as Ewurama was speaking, have there been moments where I have been in a conversation with someone where it's been a 1 or 2 time thing where that ease has somehow been created? And even though there's lots of holes to poke in this, the closest kind of answer I could come up with is times where there is a genuine questioning and asking of who you are and what your experience has been as a person, without putting the weight of forcing you to represent anything beyond who you are. Because I think very often in these conversations of race and identity, there's this imposition of, so you are from Zimbabwe, you are a white African, I'm using, you know, my identifiers, tell me about the experience of being, you know, all of those things. And those then become very different, removed, borderline performative conversations, in a way that just, tell me about your experience is not, and then with that acute awareness and listening to how all these kind of socio-political aspects that is in this world have defined and interacted with your experience. But that first point is not to extrapolate out to create these big understandings of groups. And I think that is that initial conversation is always bears more ease to me, even if it is not, you know, fully easy. It bears more ease.
Yes, I think I agree with Sam. I think in the process of communication, you find spaces where you feel at ease. Particularly when I feel I'm being seen by a different person, that this person is trying to engage with my concerns or how I perceive my racial identity in this context. And it works both ways. So I think there's instances of conversation, of communication, when people can actually see each other, and on those moments I felt comfortable. But this doesn't mean I feel comfortable in general. Like my feeling of unease in America as a Hispanic, like, will not go away because I have these wonderful moments of communication with particular people.
I'm conscious people might have places to go. So do Gerardo, Sam, final commentary, anything you want to add before we tap out? Oh, neither of you are done.
I really like your earrings, if that counts.
Thank you. I invested energy in selecting them. There are many hoop choices in my closet, so.
Oh, this was you gave a wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. But thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you to Sam and Gerardo and Jeamme, though they aren't here. Thank you for having us. Thank you for doing this. This is a huge part, Anne knows this, and Molly and Parker do too. This is leaps and bounds from when I arrived as a freshman. And so it's beautiful to know that these spaces are slowly being created so people can have this conversation early. So thank you all for coming. I hope you all have a good day and some kind of a lovely weekend wherever you are.